Rock and stone can be quite difficult to draw regardless of what material you're using. But I find that this issue is often exacerbated when someone tries to start drawing these two things with ink. So in this video, we're going to dive straight in and talk about the basics of rock and stone when you're using ink. I'm going to start with a ballpoint pen, but I'm going to be using my fine liner Micron as well, so there's some variety regardless of where you're coming from. The first thing I want to focus on is individual stones. We will eventually get to rock faces, the sides of mountains, and things like that, but they're far more complicated. So let's start with something simple. These are supposed to be river rocks, rocks that have been rubbed smooth by the water or by whatever elements they've encountered. Starting with some kind of oval shape is generally a good place to begin. Think about this as you would a sphere. And if that's intimidating, I would pause the video here and I would go work on drawing some spheres. In fact, one of the last videos that I produced was on shading spheres using ink, and so I would check that one out. But assuming that you're comfortable with basic shapes, a stone is generally just a smushed or elongated version of one of those basic shapes. So you can see on the first example, I have simply shaded from the bottom upward. I'm allowing the bottom of this object to be darker, as if the light is coming from the upper right-hand side. This, of course, shows that it is a round object, in the same way that one would shade a sphere. I'm now doing the same thing on the opposite side, though of course using a fine liner or a micron, I have to use hatching to do so. But what I'm implying is that the shape is round. And then with all the tiny little dots, the pock marks, there is perhaps some difference in the texture, and perhaps there's just some tiny little dents or formica or pieces of granite that are showing out. Now I'm going to move into actually thinking about the basic shapes: spheres, cubes, cones, or pyramids, and what a rock of each type might look like. If it feels like I'm moving a little quickly, please go ahead and pause the video and just try to work on some of these on your own. I am going to focus on the three basic shapes. And like I mentioned earlier, I think it's really beneficial as an artist that you make sure that you're at least somewhat proficient with these kinds of things. And like I've mentioned before, they always make good practice for a day where you're not 100% sure what you ought to be working on. So let's take a look at this first one, at this oval shape, which bears a lot of similarity to the one that we just worked on. I'm going to be starting with a micron. I like to give myself the exterior of the object, just so I know where the shape is. Now, it occurs to me as I'm drawing this and doing the voiceover that it's rather an interesting shape, because it wouldn't just sit like that, it would have to be leaning against something. I'm going to come in now with the ballpoint and start shading on the underside. Because of the way that this object is oriented, more of its underside is going to be dark, because the light is not going to be able to hit that far under. You're shading this in the same way that you might an egg or an apple. At a fundamental level, rocks that resemble spheres should be treated like spheres. Generally, though, their texture is not perfectly smooth, and some of that is hearkened to by having a subtle variance in the shading, by having marks that indicate that there might be cracks or fault lines in the rock in some way. While I generally advocate for making sure every decision that you make on a drawing has some thought behind it, with a rock like this, you do have to make some random marks. I suppose you could still say they're made with thought in mind, but there is some randomness to them. These cracks are going to give the illusion that the surface is not consistent. And if they're a big enough crack, they might cast their own shadows, which is something that you might want to pay attention to. After all, whenever you're working with something like this, the biggest two factors that you need to consider are form and light. Light is going to affect where your shadows are, what parts are light or dark, and form is going to allow you to show how this object exists in three-dimensional space. The shading helps tremendously with that. These two are intrinsically linked. Moving on to the cube-like rock. This might be something that is used as a building stone, but these often occur in our Rocky Mountains where I live in Colorado. It's not particularly uncommon. We have granite moss rock that sits around on our property that looks pretty similar to this, although it's very weather worn over hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of years. On this one, I'm working with a light source that's a little farther back behind my object. This is going to mean that that shadow is cast in a particular direction. The top face is still getting hit primarily by the sunlight, so it's going to be pretty white, but again, the surface of a rock is seldom perfectly smooth, and if it is, it often takes on more rudimentary qualities. The face that's coming toward us is probably, again, textured, and so pieces of it are sticking out a little bit, and those are the pieces that are catching the light. The darker portions are either avoiding the light, or even maybe one of those pieces that's sticking out and catching the light is casting a shadow upon it, which is actually what you're seeing right now in that darkest portion on the bottom. Each of these decisions are things that I'm making and thinking about as I make each mark. There's no shame, there's no reason you should be embarrassed or feel strange about taking a few moments before you dive into a face or a surface on an object. It makes sense to think for a few minutes, to try to gauge which direction a thing should go. I spend a lot of time thinking, and though this footage is not sped up at all, there is a lot of speeding up that happens in most of my videos because often I will take 20 or 30 seconds before starting something to think about it, to examine what it's doing, to make sure that I make the right decision. Let's move on to the cone. This is more along the lines of a stalactite or a stalagmite, what you might find in a cave. I have actually drawn a lot of these in the last year because I end up drawing things like creatures and monsters that might cling to the underside of a cavern or hang out in a dark cave. I find them rather fun. On this one, I'm going to work primarily with vertical hatching, as you're seeing me come to that conclusion in the background. This is an interesting decision, as both will work. This is something that you might run into the more that you work with ink, the more that you work on things like hatching. Either angle is going to function. They're going to function slightly differently, and they're going to give you different effects. But this matters more the smaller the drawing is. If you're working on a rather large drawing where the marks are so minuscule in comparison to the actual overall piece, it matters far less. But I'm going to do it both ways here so you can see what that looks like. And this is also something that could be applied to that first stone we did as well, to the spherical one. As I'm going around, I'm thinking about the light source coming from the right side, obviously, but there are still some marks, some texture along that face as well. This is not a perfectly smooth face, so it is not a perfect gradient moving from light to dark. And you can represent that by having some tiny marks indicating texture along the face. I have found that keeping things pristine often makes them far less interesting. An exception to this, however, is if you have a drawing that is very highly textured and you have only a couple things in it that are not at all, things that are very straightforward and simple, then they stick out because there's a very high level of contrast, and that is a beneficial thing. Now on this one, I'm going to use horizontal hatching. I'm going to think about the light source coming from the same angle. And you'll notice, of course, as I mentioned in prior videos, I will rotate my canvas. This is something that I do frequently when I'm drawing for myself, but something I often skip, as you just saw, when I'm working on video because it becomes very difficult to keep everything in focus. But as you are drawing for yourself, draw at whatever angle works best for you. I did skip a portion of this one as you watched me do another one from the opposite angle, but you can see the process is very similar. It still indicates all of the same things, yet the feel is just subtly different. One thing to keep in mind is if you had a lot of stones like that on the same drawing, if you were varying how you were drawing them each time, it might be rather confusing. Now, let's take a look at something that's going to occur a little bit more frequently than a singular standalone stone. What happens when you have a whole bunch of rocks or stones together? This is, of course, something you will see in the mountains or in a river valley, and it's going to create some intriguing mental gymnastics, some problems that you have to think about. Each of these is obviously semi-spherical, they're more elliptical in nature. Not only are these objects affected by light, but they're also affected by the shadows cast by one another. You can see that here as I begin to work on it. I'm mapping out the areas that are going to be struck and shadowed by the object that is above. This is a fun practice, though it can be a little frustrating. If this is something that does not come very naturally for you, it might be a skill that you want to put some time into. Perhaps start very simply with just spheres, one sphere above another. And if you find that it's hard for you to think about this and twist the objects in your mind, I would encourage you to just grab a couple objects, maybe grab several apples, stack one above the other, make sure you have a decent light source so you can try to tell how light is affecting those things. But this is something that's going to happen frequently. When you work with mountains or hills, depending on where the sun is at, they will cast shadows on one another. This is again a thing you need to be conscious of if you want your rock and stone to look semi-realistic. While realism is not always everyone's goal, it is, however, something that is important to work toward. And I think this is because when you understand how complicated reality is, you can begin to understand better how to simplify it. So let's take a look at a fairly complicated rock. This is just one that I'm creating and fabricating out of my mind because it's good practice for me. But I have done a lot of this and continue to do it. In fact, I did some later on this very day I was recording this. I worked from actual reference photos and drew several examples of stone. So when you're working with a rock that is not a perfect spherical representation, not a perfect cubical representation, which of course is most rock and stone, you have to think about each plane, each surface, and what they are. On this example, there are several different planes at different angles. There are areas that are more rounded, as you see on the left side or even on the upper right. Thinking about where your light comes from allows you to create these objects better from your imagination. And if creating these rocks and stones directly from your imagination is something you don't feel comfortable with now, which is fine by the way, that's been me for most of the time I've been drawing, feel free to just look up some examples. Or if you're fortunate enough to live in an area that has rock and stone readily available, go grab some or go plop yourself next to them. But when you draw them, don't just draw what you see. Look at the rock, try to figure out what it is. Why is that particular area darker than another part? If you look for the planes, if you look for what is casting the shadow on the surface below it, you will begin to understand how the rock and stone function. This has been a difficult thing for me. I've looked up lots of tutorials over the last 5 years. I've spent time painting and drawing them, and I had to realize that though I was good at copying things, I could go sit next to a stone and draw it and make it photorealistic. I wasn't understanding what I was drawing until I started to break the objects down in my mind and think about why. Why does this thing look the way it does? If you've copied a lot from reference over the years and struggle to draw from imagination, that is probably one of the causes for that, because you can copy from something and simply replicate. If you spend the time, however, while you're copying, thinking about what it is that you're actually doing and why those features exist on that shape or form, you will be able to draw from imagination better. On these stones, I'm thinking about what happens if you've got a chunk missing. And this is actually one of the best practices that you can do when it comes to drawing any kind of shape and learning how to draw form better. Take a basic shape, a sphere, a cylinder, a cube, a cone, and take chunks out of it, or add chunks onto it. This forces you to think about the why, just like I was mentioning a moment before. You are thinking in this situation because you have no other choice about why things are the way they are. Is that lip going to cast a shadow? Is it going to catch extra light? Now, sometimes these are difficult for me as well. In some of these pseudo-spheres, I'm thinking, okay, well, how am I going to represent that? And ink is a difficult medium to do this. But practice is always a good choice. Now, obviously, the deep parts of this cutout are going to be darker because less light's going to get back in there. But as it's going to get further out towards the exterior, more light is going to be caught. The light source on this one seems to be fairly intense. It's creating dark shadows on the underside of the object. On this second object, I am working with the assumption that the top has been shorn off. This doesn't affect the lower portion of the rock, and so I'm going to shade it accordingly. I'm working on these rather quickly just to give some examples, and perhaps if you are interested in continuing to work on your rock and stone skills, some things that you can practice as well. This can be rather difficult because the top surface here is obviously going to be rough unless some strange magical or mystical thing has happened and it's perfectly polished, in which case it wouldn't have that jagged edge though, so we know that it's going to have some texture. I'm attempting to shade this to indicate that there is some innate roughness, but this can be quite difficult to do. This is a good thing to practice, and I would highly encourage you to look up some references and some resources if you're going to work on more intricate things such as this. All of these kinds of exercises are beneficial because they make you think. They stop you in your tracks and doing the thing that you are comfortable with, that you understand, and they force you to analyze. Any kind of drawing practice that does that is going to be beneficial for you. It might not always assist exactly what you're doing at that moment, but that is of little consequence. On this next one, I'm going to work with an object that has some chunks coming out of it, some chunks cut out of it. I know that sounds very similar, but it's going to have some that's been excised and some that's been added. These two lips on the bottom are almost like little jagged chunks that have been removed from the sphere. And so they're going to have deep shadows because they're going to cut in. That lip above is going to cast a shadow down. Now, the portion that I'm shading right now is a chunk of rock that maybe has been glued to it or is simply sticking out from that surface. Obviously, it is going to be shaded as if it is semi-spherical, but it's going to cast a shadow on the surface below it as well. This one on the right side, however, is almost wrapping around the object. It's almost like a cylinder that has been pushed onto that, like clay that has been pushed onto a larger surface. The rest of the object, of course, is going to be shaded rather normally. And this is, again, one of those things that is really beneficial when you're drawing rock and stone, when you're working on ink in general, is think about each mark you make. Obviously, I'm shading a bunch with a ballpoint pen here, so I'm not thinking about literally every mark, but I'm thinking about every pass that I make. I'm going back now for a second pass because things needed to be darker. Things around the edges will be darker generally because the surface is layering up in our vision. Though we do see with two eyes, things on the edges tend to get collapsed in on each other and they often appear darker. Except if the light source is back behind the object, where that edge could actually be catching additional light and then be brighter. But again, I am talking about so many things while I draw these, and I hope that it's beneficial to you, because there's just a lot that you can think about and consider while you're drawing these things. If you find that overwhelming though, start simple. Start with a couple rocks that you find or you pocket when you're at the park next. Bring them home, set them up, make sure there's some reasonable light source so you have a decent shadow and cast shadow, and just start drawing. This next one I'm going to leave mostly spherical, and I'm going to work on a different strategy for texturing it. So before I shade anything, I'm putting some cracks on the object. I'm putting maybe some dents, but in my mind, they are simply other kinds of stone that are wedged into this rock. You see this a lot with granite, which we have a ton of around here. It's not consistent. It's not just one tone of gray. It's got grays and blacks and pieces of formica that are shiny, and then sometimes pieces of quartz that reflect the light, sometimes that are darker. So in order to approximate that, I'm giving you a very simple strategy. You can create these extra dots and marks. You can do this via hatching if you're working with a fine liner, and sometimes cracks are an interesting way to do that as well. Then subtly building up the shading over top of it, treating it as if that's just the native surface, is a good way to have all of those elements incorporated. If you were to shade it first and then go do this, it would obviously work, but it's a little bit more difficult. This way of building it up subtly is going to give you a result that often looks a little bit more realistic. I am keeping these examples pretty simple. These are just tiny little samples that will hopefully help you as you're trying to figure out how to master stone and rock. And honestly, like most things with drawing, it's going to be done with a ludicrous amount of practice. For this last one, I'm going to be working with a fine liner again, which I vastly prefer. But The ballpoint pen is a really good entry point and one that I really enjoy working with. But it makes sense in my mind, at least, to vary this. Regardless of whatever medium you are working with now, perhaps another is going to shine out as a beacon somewhere along the line. And it's good to see that each thing functions a little differently. I have to be more thoughtful when I'm working with a micron like this, though, because each line is so much darker, so much more permanent. So I have to build things up slowly. And I do this with the ballpoint as well, just slow shading passes. But on this, I'm thinking about each line, each stroke of that pen. There's a certain kind of meditation to working with a micron that I really enjoy, whereas I treat the ballpoint a lot more like a semi-permanent pencil. Both are wonderful, but I feel like both have their place. So whatever it is that you lean into, I would encourage you to try the other as well. Well, as always, thank you for your time. I hope that this lesson was beneficial for you. I would love to hear which part you took the most from and what you would like to see next time. These kinds of comments always help me. They tell me which way to take the content and what is most beneficial for you who are watching and listening. If you want to check out my Patreon, you can do so in the link below. In addition, though, we have a free Discord community associated with this channel, where we have the opportunity to show our artwork, get feedback on things. It's just a lovely little community. And if you don't have one, or maybe even if you do, I would encourage you to check it out. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.